one is that we are really grateful for everybody attending today. The response to this event has been fantastic. First of all, thank you very much to Polkadot, because they have been extremely supporting with this project since the very, very beginning. And of course, to all the protocols that were really supporting the idea and providing a representative. Well, let's start really fast. I always do this intro because some people sometimes would like to find out who we are and what we do, and why this ecosystem is so meaningful, of course, in Switzerland, but as well internationally. So up to now, in the latest top 50 report, we have, well, CVVC, the venture capital company that hosts a group of companies and initiatives. I will explain further that among them Civil Labs. They do this report. We monitor every half a year how the Crypto Valley ecosystem is doing regarding companies. So there is, you can check the report here, like if you have curiosity, it is published, it's online. So we track the top 50 companies. Up to now, we have 990 registered in the Crypto Valley. The valuations, of course, as you can see, are super high. And today we're really, it's quite special because we will have 4 of the 6 unicorns represented here in the panel. If you're curious who they are, it's Ethereum, Polkadot, Tezos, and Cardano. But you can have access to the full report if you wish. It's published online. Well, who we are? CVVC is a venture capital company, and the objective is to support startups in blockchain. So my colleague Nikolai will develop more and will give an introduction on the incubation programs, the program that we have run, and the next batch for next year. But still, CVVC is the main company, and from there is another initiatives like advisory, Civil Labs, that is this co-working space where we are now, competitions, summits, CV maps. So, what is happening is CVVC has created an entire ecosystem to support the startups. Not just to give the money, but as well to give the environment, the connections, and the right platforms for the startups to have enough interaction with the different blockchain players. So what we do here at Civil Labs, we are now in a co-working space here in Zug, but as well we do events, education, community building, advisory, and of course the incubation and the excubation programs. Civil Labs has more than one space. This is the space in Zug. We have another facilities in Liechtenstein, and we are opening in Dubai. Everything is ready. So Civil Labs Dubai is there, and there is plans to open in Asia. And of course, we have partners with other with other players in different parts of the world. Now I will pass the word to Nikolai to talk about the incubation program.
Hello everybody, welcome to Civil Labs. So I'm Nikolai. For those who don't know who I am, I run the incubator, so I co-designed it, and I'm kind of responsible for the incubation program. We did already 2 batches. All were on site. Now the next batch will be in Q1, which will be the first batch and will be virtual. I'm going to keep it short. As I said, the next batch is Q1. It's going to be online. Why our incubation batch? Because we're blockchain focused. We have big narratives on blockchain. We have a protocol week with all the biggest protocols. Some of them are also here. We protocol agnostic. We have over 80 mentors and experts from the crypto space, but also beyond. Then by founders, for founders. So most of us did the startup before. You have a mentor who has an entrepreneurial background. Then a dedicated ecosystem. I think Camille already said quite a lot about Crypto Valley and CV Labs. It's over 900 companies here in the space. We have in-house a lot of people and a lot of knowledge. And now we convert everything into a virtual program, which will start soon. So if you know somebody, or if you have a startup, come join us. Apply now, because the applications are open till November, mid-November, and you will get up to 125,000 funding and return of 10% equity, kind of standard VC deal, incubation deal, and of course a dedicated mentor. So let's start with the event.
Yes, please. We want Laboon to come here to stage. Bill, please, the stage is all yours.
Thank you.
We can have lights.
Okay. Oh, I thought I was going to have to yell, but thank you. So welcome everybody to this Proof of Stake event tonight. My name is Bill Laboon. I'm the Technical Education Lead at Web3 Foundation, right here in Zug, just down Barerstrasse a bit. We can stop looking at my huge face here. So I'm going to give just a very high-level overview of what proof of stake is, how it differs from proof of work, and some of the benefits of it. And after this, we'll transition to a more roundtable event or questioning event, where representatives from several major protocols that use proof of stake will answer questions and sort of explain how their specific proof of stake implementations differ. So this is going to be, again, very high level. If you're extremely technical, I apologize. I'll try not to bore you too much. So getting really down to your fundamental aspects, what is a blockchain, right? It's a chain of blocks, but more specifically, we all need to decide, all the users of the system, on some canonical history and ordering of these blocks. So if you look actually at this, you can see that each block refers to the previous block. There is no way at some point in time to know what the block in the future is going to be like. So we can only look backwards. Each block can refer to the previous block. But what happens, if I hit into a chair, what happens if we have multiple blocks that both say to the network, that both indicate that they are the next block in the chain? So again, we can't look forward. There's nothing we can say in this block to tell us that this is where we should go or this is where we should go in the canonical chain. And the problem with this, it's not going to let us make a canonical history, which means we're vulnerable to a double spend attack. So double spend attack, again, just a very brief overview for people who aren't familiar. So Mallory, our malicious adversary here, gives Bob 5 Bitcoin in exchange for 5,000 francs. Bob says this is a great deal, so he gives her 5,000 francs or a house or whatever off-chain. So Bob is very happy. He sees that a block was produced, that Mallory gave him 5 Bitcoin, he gives her the 5,000 francs, and all is well. But secretly, Mallory creates another block and gives herself 5 Bitcoin. So instead of sending it to Bob, she just sends it back to herself. And if she is able to convince the rest of the network that she's on the canonical chain, that block will be ignored. And now Bob has 0 francs, because he gave it to Mallory, and 0 Bitcoin, because his transaction where he got the Bitcoin is not on the canonical chain. Mallory is sitting pretty with 5,000 francs and 5 Bitcoin. So the problem here is we need some way to stop anyone from producing blocks. And the key part of Bitcoin, again, very high level here, is that producing blocks is very difficult. So the miners in Bitcoin create a block, and solve a partial hash pre-image puzzle. This problem is very hard to do, but it's very easy to verify. So Mallory theoretically could do this. She could make a block and then make a separate false block to show to Bob, but this would require immense amounts of computing power. And it may not even just be possible, simply be too much work. So it wouldn't really make sense for Mallory to spend 500 Bitcoin worth of computing power in order to run her 5 Bitcoin scam. So this is why you need some sort of way to prevent just anyone producing blocks. There has to be some difficulty or limitation associated with it. And proof of work does a very good job of doing this, of making sure that we don't have this double spend attack. However, there are a lot of drawbacks to it, right, that most people here are familiar with if you've heard any arguments against blockchain. Right? It's extremely high electricity usage. Proof of work requires sort of an ever-increasing amount of electricity and computational power. So the latest estimates is that running Bitcoin, which is just one proof of work chain, albeit the biggest one, uses more electricity per year than Austria. Something that's not talked a lot about, and also in regards to proof of work problems, is the amount of electronic waste it produces. Because now you need specialized hardware to mine, and when this hardware becomes obsolete, nothing to do with it but throw it away. All it does is mine Bitcoin. If it's no longer efficient to do that because there's a new model, well, that's electronic waste. So actually there have been estimates that the amount of electronic waste produced by Bitcoin mining is about equal to all the electronic waste produced by Luxembourg. There's very high variance in block times. So if you've ever done a Bitcoin transaction, you know that, oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to stay out of the thing. All right, better? Okay. If you've ever done a Bitcoin transaction, you know it may take a few minutes to get into a block. It may take a very long time, right? Tens of minutes. And finally, we see a lot of concentrated mining because there are huge economies of scale to proof of work. Running a hobbyist miner in your closet is not going to be nearly as efficient as having a large-scale mining operation in terms of hashes per kilowatt. So there are a lot of solutions that have been proposed to solve some of these problems while still maintaining security of the blockchain. An interesting one that's actually not talked much about nowadays is proof of useful work. So instead of doing, just solving hash puzzles, we actually try to cure cancer or see how to fold proteins. Although there are a lot of problems with that, which is why it hasn't taken off very much. There are proof of storage solutions, where instead of showing that you are running a lot of computations, you show you have a lot of hard drive space, essentially. There are hybrid proof of work systems that use some other parts of the system along with proof of work. There's proof of authority, where we say, I'm only going to trust a certain subset of all of the nodes out there that are predefined ahead of time. Although there are obviously centralization and issues with this. But the particular solution we want to discuss tonight is proof of stake. So proof of stake means that in order to produce blocks, you need to have some stake, some tokens in your account. And that will give you, in some sense, the right to produce and validate blocks. So if you hold on to your stake and you let the network know in some manner, and again, different networks are going to have different approaches to doing this, you will have the possibility to produce the next block. So here we can see we've got 5, as we call them, validators. You'll hear slightly different names used in different networks. And They each have put up a certain amount of the token native to the network, and in return, they have the ability to produce, the possibility rather, to produce a block. So there are some problems with proof of stake, and hopefully we'll discuss some of these. And one is, how do you ensure that we don't have one single validator cheating the system in some sense? And we actually could have one validator try to say, for instance, that chain A is valid and chain B is valid. So block A and block B, which both go off the previous block, if one validator says both are valid, this could cause problems. So what we have is these bonded tokens that we staked, or also often, and again, different networks are going to approach this slightly differently, but I want to make sure everyone knows the terminology, can be slashed. That means if they do something bad, so we have here our bad validator here, everyone else can actually, the network can actually take away some percentage or even all of those bonded tokens. So this is the basic concept behind proof of stake. As I mentioned, all of the different protocols tonight are going to have slightly different approaches to it. So we can discuss about the specifics of how they do it, and even if they do have things, concepts like slashing. All right, so shall we start with the roundtable?
Yeah, I think I asked right now. Please go next slide. I need to ask the presence of our panelists. First, Bill, you can just take seat there. Maxime, please, who else is here? I'm afraid can we leave that seat for Maxime, so our panelists that are participating here. We are Christian, please come on stage. So, first of all, thank you to all the panelists for accepting the invitation, because it has been quite an interesting endeavor to get them all, like all protocols in one panel, and we are so fortunate to have really top-notch specialists. We have two panelists joining online, Dr. Aggelos Kiayas and Darren, they are in the UK. So, fantastic, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, great.
Dankrat? Dankrat is... Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Dankrat Face is representing Ethereum, Aggelos is representing Cardano Foundation, IOHK. Well, without further ado, I will give you some microphones. And then we can start the panel. So please, you can have this one, and I will give a second one too. Yeah, fantastic.
We have phone free leadership.
If you want to sanitize microphones. Okay, yes, so please just guys start.
I have one question. Do I still have to keep attention if
There's no problem.
keep attention to our Telegram channel or no?
No, it's fine. It's fine. No need.
Yes. Oh, nice. Thanks for coming and thanks for organizing and CVVC. It's quite became quite big event. Maybe when we started just where you do a kind of finished what benefits, or you can also take, when you answer the questions in historical perspective, why at all we have to, in your opinion, to develop something beyond Bitcoin, proof of work, selection mechanism for mining. So you build.
Sorry, I can't really hear anything here. Your question, like, get closer to the microphone, or?
Yeah. Now, can you hear now?
Yeah, that's about.
Yeah, but
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So if we, with continue where Bill kind of just finished. Benefits proof of stake over proof of work, in your opinion? And can be also historically why suddenly we had to do something else? Bitcoin was good, was working. Yeah, Ethereum was working until recently.
It still works.
Oh, I mean, like until it really became very expensive, which we didn't have before on Ethereum. So why so long time? And proof of stakes started always a long time ago, like 3, 4, 5 years ago. Research started. Why, in your opinion?
Yeah, I can quickly start on this. I'm Adrian, nice to see you, and whoever's watching online. I want to start with something like proof of stake is not a consensus mechanism. This is often mistaken. Proof of work is also not a consensus mechanism. Proof of work traditionally uses Nakamoto consensus, which is known as chain consensus, and proof of stake normally ends up using some form of fast penalty BFT. But proof of work and proof of stake are ways for civil resistance in these systems, nothing else really. They say who's allowed to participate and not how participants come to consensus on the network. I mean, there are obviously some shortcomings with proof of stake and proof of work, but I think, actually, it's important to realize that I think proof of stake isn't there to replace proof of work. Like, proof of work has probably a place. We are not going to switch Bitcoin to proof of stake tomorrow. Because there are some things that proof of work is better at than proof of stake, right? So it's not just either or, it's probably going to be both for a long time. But some of the fundamental shortcomings that proof of work had was that it was very hard to make very efficient or very low block times chains and as a developer, as a protocol developer, you had a lot less control over what kind of economic systems you could build in proof of work. Because proof of work fundamentally relies on electricity and some mining. Whereas in proof of stake, you have control over the sort of base asset, and so you can start playing a lot more with economics on these systems. And the other thing is that proof of stake sort of works somewhat better with fast penalty BFT, and proof of work doesn't. And fast penalty BFT gives you lots of usability advantages, which is why we ended up with this. So you can have like half-second block times that are final within half a second, instead of having to wait 60 minutes in Bitcoin. Yeah, maybe this was sort of a very rambling answer, but I hope the rest can take it away.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe Fabiola, how do we invite someone else to talk from our remote panels on this?
I hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so Dankert, what will be your opinion? Or how do you see? Can you add something on top of it?
You are muted.
Can you say the question exactly? It's really hard to hear anything here. Did you know what you want to say?
Repeat the question.
Yeah. The way we can get advantage from proof of stake or proof of work, in which area do you see? And the main reason it was inevitable.
Right. I mean, like, so obviously, I mean, the big downside of proof of stake is that it's complexity, but other than that, it will provide like huge advantages in many ways. Like like the obvious one is, I think to me, is that in proof of work, the only thing that is ever at stake is your current reward. Like you cannot lose more than like what you're currently investing in terms of work. Whereas with proof of stake, obviously due to the stake, we have access to we can penalize people as well as just taking their current rewards away, and that is essentially what gives us the great advantages. Like that means you can you can basically leverage the stake a lot more. Like otherwise, people invest huge amounts into hardware. But essentially, we don't get any back investments. Like they are hugely under-leveraged as capital, and proof of stake can fully leverage them. That's how I would see it. So that's why we can do things like you can tell stakers what to do. So for example, sharding is impossible without proof of stake. Why? Because you cannot tell a miner to go on a shard and do something because they don't have any kind of identity. where you can tell the staker that they should go on a committee and check what's going on in the shard. So, for example, sharding is only enabled through proof of stake.
Okay. Aggelos, now what if...
Yeah, so let me add to this a bit from a slightly different angle. I agree with the general statements that other people just already set out. I think it's useful to think about a bit about consensus before Nakamoto and after Nakamoto. I think it's also useful to think about this in general from the computer science point of view. What we learned from Nakamoto, like the Bitcoin blockchain, we also learned that it's possible to come up with a consensus mechanism that's based on resource. And Nakamoto's resource of choice was computational power. Why this is very interesting? So it is interesting because if you see, consensus problem is a problem that has been studied over decades. The way people were thinking about consensus before was always tied to either an identity infrastructure or well-defined nodes that they knew each other and would send messages to each other. So what is really innovative here that happened in the last decade is that Nakamoto thought about consensus at a global scale. And obviously, when you think about a consensus protocol at a global scale, there is no way to get an identity infrastructure that is pretty agreed, because who's going to set it up? You have to trust someone to set it up. So if you think about the enterprise setting, like this identity infrastructure always makes sense, right? There's an enterprise that's going to set up like an identity infrastructure, and then people will run a BFT protocol, for instance. So Nakamoto has this resource at the center, and then there's a protocol that is based on that. And Nakamoto's choice there was computational power. So with that choice, there come like a number of disadvantages. To prove that you possess the resource, for example, you have to spend energy and build a nice presentation at the beginning, pointing out to the downsides that this has. Another aspect that we haven't touched yet is the fact that the resource may not be easily accessible by everyone, or it might be more easily accessible by some people and less easily accessible by others. So if you see the geographic distribution of Bitcoin miners, it's not uniform around the world. And there are good reasons for that. It's because accessing the resource which is at the center of the Bitcoin system is not equal, right, to different places. So different places have a much cheaper way of acquiring energy. So if you go to a virtual resource, so I'm going to also add that to the benefits of proof of stake, aside of those that have been said already, is the fact that it's a virtual resource. So as long as we make it abundant, fungible, and easily accessible, it gives an opportunity for a more equitable participation in the underlying system. So this is another virtue that we may aspire to get by focusing on proof of stake system, which is on top of all the other benefits, the cost efficiency or the potential to use more readily classical design techniques and tools to sharding and other blockchain could benefit from these cryptographic systems that are based on identities. So, and back onto you, Marcel.
Okay, yeah, thank you for this perspective. Gil, do you want to something to double top what you said before?
Well, I sort of wanted to add on to what Aglos just said, and my impression of one of the benefits of proof of stake. And I'm coming from a perspective that proof of work and proof of stake trade-offs. I think there's room for both of them, like Adrian said. But one of the interesting things I think also about proof of stake is it's much easier. Like you're going off from equitable, it's easier for people to start staking and start helping to secure the network as compared to again Bitcoin or even some of the ASIC resistant coins. There's still a lot of work involved in getting that first step into it. Whereas proof of stake, often, and obviously some networks do this better than others, it's generally easy if you have some stake, you can start staking and seeing you're being part of the network.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I can send it to you.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, most important things have been said, so maybe just to keep it short, in my opinion, the biggest issue with proof of stake is just this energy waste, and proof of stake doesn't have that, so that's why I think it's not sustainable in the long run to have this proof of work for everything.
Okay, yeah, I think with this overview we actually covered most of it. And then if we start from the same point and start in an opposite direction, now in a proof of stake we allow real decentralization to start happening. Yeah? Means like literally almost anyone can participate, being direct validator or delegate your stake to someone to become validator. It's much easier to be part of the process. Like in current in Bitcoin, you participate if you're not miner, and vast majority of miner, you're just speculating. And here you can secure the network. So the question would be, by this bringing, opening the gate, so many people to participate, does it reduce security? Does it increase security? How does it influence security of the network? Because so many people, it means complexity grows exponentially to design the whole system. So how do you see security of proof of stake compared to proof of work of Bitcoin? Is it better, worse? Is it worse now to become better? And maybe we start with the...
Okay, yeah, so I mean, as was said before, the resource that's actually relevant for your power you have in the system is not kind of how many people there are, right? But how much, in this case, stake you have, or how much computing power you have for Bitcoin. So that means if you have many people and they all have only very little stake, then they can also not cause real damage because they only have very little power, right? So that means to actually reduce security in the way you alluded to, you would need to have also a lot of stake, which is expensive, hopefully, to buy, right? So that's why I don't think you get less security because of this, if it's implemented properly, of course. Because, I mean, if you have a lot of money to buy a lot of stake, you could also buy a lot of computers to run a lot of Bitcoin miners, right? So, in my opinion, this is not a contradiction to get security.
Actually, to this point, I was thinking, because I'm from science and coming more from investment and this part of the crypto space analytics, with the growing complexity of financial market in general, and now we see the growing complexity in crypto market, it's generally possible to use a lot of not only spot exchange but derivatives markets and options, and you can potentially, if you're smart enough, move your money around in the sense of few transactions, few blocks, and move market a lot for coins which are not Bitcoin or Ethereum, and have a huge impact if you want to at the moment. Without physically buying hardware, because it's a long process to buy hardware or to run. And doing financial speculation nowadays is a very easy thing. So, do you see danger here too?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. I think there's a good analogy between, at least how I see proof of stake happening, and things like options and more advanced financial derivatives. So one of the things, if you get into Bitcoin, very few people, until you're generally very comfortable with Bitcoin, would ever try to run a miner. But you see a lot of people just get into a proof of stake system and say, all right, well, I can stake, and then they're more likely, perhaps to make mistakes. So you're just like in the real world, right? Having options and having derivatives can help the systemic stability of the financial system. But it also means that somebody who buys some 100x leveraged, naked put, I don't know, another finance can mess themselves up, right? Like very, very easily, and someone else, perhaps on an individual basis, could, they try to stake, but they get scammed or they, get slashed because it's easier. So there's always that trade-off in terms of security between systemic and individual, and. Yeah, so I don't know, I'm not saying that proof of stake, I didn't come here to say it's a panacea, that it's going to solve everything, but I think it introduces some security problems and also helps with some security as well.
Angelos, what would you say? security of proof of stake networks. Is it already now for those networks we are discussing now established on a level high enough to compare to proof of work, or it's still more fragile?
Yeah, so everything boils down again to the basic assumptions that the system has. And proof of stake and proof of work, they use a different resource. They're both resource-based consensus systems, and they use a different resource to argue their security. So, because of the resource is different, there are different features in their security profile that are produced. So just to give a perspective that hasn't been touched yet in the discussion so far. So, as it was correctly mentioned, you acquire the resource. Acquiring the resource is something that costs money. So, in both cases, like someone that has money may try to acquire a lot of the resource and influence the protocol. Now, in the proof of stake case, acquiring the resource is kind of like it's an event in the market, right? So you have to go to an exchange, you have to contact people that have the resource. Something has to happen in order for you to acquire the resource. In the proof of work case, on the other hand, you can acquire the resource in a way which is not a public event. For small proof of work systems, actually, we've seen examples where a small difficulty proof of work blockchain has been attacked, and there were even in cases of systems like Ethereum Classic that have still significant computational power, they have experienced very, very long reorganization attacks. So this is an example of having access to the resource in a way that changes the balance in the security for a particular deployment. So I think proof of stake systems are secure in their own threat model and for their sort of resource that they offer. They have their challenges, and I think one of the challenges which is unique is the fact that it's a virtual resource which is tied to a cryptographic key, and thus when you run a proof of stake system, you are responsible for running an online server that has sensitive cryptographic key material, and you are responsible for doing this key management, and this is certainly an order of complexity more than a proof of work system, which doesn't require this cryptographic key material to be applied in order to participate in the protocol. So that's another example where these things are different. But typically, for all the practical purposes we discussed, proof of stake systems are fit for purpose and could serve as global ledgers for the type of application that we are interested in. Maxim, back to you.
That's a good point indeed. Now I'm recalling how many proof of work systems have been attacked successfully in the last few years. Yeah, indeed happened. Democrat, I remember you wanted to address this question too when we were chatting.
All right. Sorry, this is about security. So yeah, I think that I agree with the last point. This is the big point about proof of stake security will be key security. So that's absolutely the off-stack requirement. If someone hacks your miner, once you're there and you fix it, the hacker is gone. Once your private key is compromised, you can't do anything. That's right. So that's a huge difference, and that's just something we have to be aware of. This will probably be our focus for the next few years to come. To add one more thing that a threat to proof of stake network, that's the whole issue about time synchronization. Typically, we have quite high requirements for all the participants to be exactly in sync, and this is also something that could turn into a potential threat vector. So, yeah. But otherwise, I think generally speaking, proof of stake, once we are familiar with it, will turn out to be way more secure than proof of work because of the things I've already mentioned before.
Yeah, so from my perspective, there's sort of a practical concern is, are most proof of stake chains more secure than sort of the older proof of work chains right now? And then the question really is, well, on the consensus level, maybe due to economic security, but on the protocol level, right, things like Polkadot or Tezos are whether in the proof of stake implementation, the consensus implementation, the governance implementation, it doesn't really matter where, but it's much more likely that we find serious security vulnerabilities in the novel systems rather than something like legacy Ethereum or Bitcoin. And this will also apply to ETH too, right? Like the attack surface is just going to be a lot larger and has been a lot less well studied. I think overall, proof of stake will probably have a somewhat higher security margin over the long run once sort of you have equal levels of assurance for the protocol implementations, simply because there is much more at stake in proof of stake, which sounds ironic, but it's the case. It's sort of the equivalent to this in proof of work is that you could imagine that there's a decentralized fleet of drones flying around the planet, and every time a miner tries to reorg, they just start bombing the ASICs, right? This is what actually happens in proof of stake. The Web3 Foundation may have experienced this a little bit, that like if keys get mismanaged to some extent, stake gets lost. So I think in the long run, there will be a lot more money at stake in proof of stake networks and proof of work networks. But your point is also true that proof of stake, with everything being a virtual asset, we can start building very complex financial products over staked assets, right? And we haven't seen this much yet, but this is going to come. So currently, when you stake an asset, it's normally locked and you can't actively trade it, so you have to unbond it in order to trade it. This will change. This NIA is going for programmable staking. ETH2 will do the same thing, so people can start layering financial products on top of staked assets, which may become a very large systemic risk, depending on whether people actually fundamentally understand what these products do and sort of where the final risks lie. And I'm kind of personally worried that by creating this entire financial system around the base security assumptions of our systems, we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot, because in 10 years from now, no one understands what these layers actually do, and all of a sudden, a black swan event starts wiping out a bunch of these derivatives, because this is what happened with traditional financial markets. Of course, we have the benefit that most of the data is currently public, so maybe this is less of an issue. But this is sort of the biggest worry I have about proof of stake, that we're going to turn this into a massive casino, what really should just be a base layer security function, and not a fancy derivatives thing where you like take a staked asset and put it in an options contract and like see what happens.
Well, that's a very good point. I cannot agree more. Complexity in Blackstone. Yeah, okay, it's a separate topic for itself. But the good thing is, what I personally like a lot in crypto blockchain space, because there is always something on stake which, if you try to attack, you can get it. So there are constant actually attacks happening. The reasons we don't get so much notion of it is just most of them are unsuccessful, or people don't find a way to attack properly. Like in the DeFi space, the last 4 months there have been a lot of attacks and quite some successful, where people get few millions a night. So, but you learn very fast. It's also a good side. Yeah, it's attacked, it's crashed, but the next iteration is much better, and it's happening innovation very fast. So, if complexity is not growing too fast, I see it good. We will grow nicely. Then maybe for the next, as we started complexity and participation of many people, the next question would be economic model of different protocols, reward, slashing, and delegation of tokens. For me, who, for instance, doesn't want to care much how not efficient enough knowledge, how can I secure the whole infrastructure, just want to delegate my own stake. How is it working? I guess it's working differently in many protocols from what I know. I would like to know 3 key things. How reward is structured? Is it transparent for every participant? How reward is distributed? Is it adjustable on protocol level? Percentage of given to validators, and slash conditions. Are they transparent? Are they adjustable on a protocol level, or are they set in stone, etc.? And how do you see it's evolving over the years? Because it's economical models may be one of the most interesting part of proof of stakes, because it's very different from before.
Right. So in general, you have the model that generally speaking, the modern consensus instances can't really run with hundreds of thousands of validators at the same time. So in proof of stake, you usually have a bunch of people that are validators, and this sort of varies between networks. Some networks start at like 50, and then you sort of go up to 600 Kusama, and maybe over time this expands to 10,000, but this is definitely not hundreds of millions of people participating here. And then you have delegators, and other networks they're called other things, right? Polkadot calls them nominators. Everyone likes to make up their own terms. They're effectively the same thing though. Delegators delegate to some nominator, and usually everyone is slashable in these systems. And they're slashable for two large categories of faults. One is liveness faults, so not being online, not using signatures, and the second one is safety faults, signing conflicting blocks effectively. And there are different thoughts on how you slash them. So, for example, Tezos doesn't slash delegators, where only the validators themselves put up the stake. Cosmos, Polkadot slash also delegators. And some newer networks like Near slash no one, which is probably not a good long-term strategy, if I'm honest, because that leads to issues. But yeah, so and overall, so I can give you the examples of Tezos. It's like 80% or so staked of the assets are staked. Usually, this also comes with lockup periods, right? Staking due to long-range attacks and proof-of-stake networks. We have to ensure that we have an unbonding window so that we can't sort of I can't double sign the next block and then withdraw everything the block after. So we have to have an unbonding window so that you're slashable for a certain period of time. This is normally like 3 weeks in most cases. And there is no liveness slashing in Tezos. There's only safety slashing. And there are about like 400 independent validators or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe then the same questions. Amount of validators, how you envision it? Or how it's designed in the system, reward conditions, and especially the slashing. Are both delegators and validators are slashed, or only those who really make mistakes, and if I just gave him my money and not slashed?
Yeah, so I mean, so in E2 we've taken like quite a different design decision here, because we actually support a massive number of validators. I think compared to most other protocols, like our aim is to enable tens to hundreds of thousands of validators, and like the design capacity is more like 1 million. And so the reason for this is we don't really believe in delegation. So delegation, in our opinion, doesn't really add any kind of value. Like the big danger, I mean, in my opinion, are that you basically you will probably specify for quite high validator hardware requirements, so you really leave it to a few big guys who really specialize in this, and sure you can vote them out, but can you really, once they've taken over the network, I'm not really convinced of this, whereas we always have the ability that the little guy can take back over, even, of course, we will always see some amount of concentration, like let's be honest about that, but yes. In terms of rewards, our rewards depend on the amount of ether staked, so it's dynamic. This is intentional, so that like if we have a very low amount of ether staked, then there will be higher incentive to stake, and if it's very high, then it trails off. So that like there's no reason to like stake off the ETH, because there are other uses for ether as well. So it's a square root function. Yeah, we expected that due to our cost computations that the rewards will be around 5 to 10% per year, but it all depends. Maybe a lot more people want to stake just because they have no other use for their ether. I don't know. Slashing. So very clearly we believe in slashing, and it's a very important tool. And the way we do it is basically, so the usual slashing is you just make a mistake in quotation marks, like if there's just something. So first, like let's say like the being inactive is not a slashable problem. So you never get slashed for just not producing a block on attestation. So that you will get a penalty, but that is very, very small. So that just discourages from staking and doing nothing. Slashing is really for like offenses that can compromise the security, such as voting for 2 different chains. And In the cases where this happens just to single or small number validators, the penalty is quite small, about 3% of the stake, but it rises the more validators use at the same time. The reason for that is only when many validators equivocate at the same time it has any real impact on security, and in this case, up to the whole stake can be slashed. So that's our approach to rewards and penalties.
Okay.
I actually have a question on this. Do you expect there to be a million independent validators, or is it going to look somewhat similar to Polkadot Kusama, where individual organizations end up running multiple validators?
Right. So I mean, as I said, 1 million would be kind of the limit that the designer for the protocol. I would not expect that this is actually all completely independent. Like, of course, there will be like clusters in there. But basically, our design unit is like 32 ETH, that's one validator, and we always take that as one unit. And we make sure that should actually be a profitable unit to stake. That's our goal. That you can do it and just have like your Raspberry Pi at home that runs stake.
Okay, thank you. I already see those differences. Interesting. Agilus, how is it done in Cardano?
Yeah, so in Cardano, you do have delegation, and we believe delegation actually plays a very important role in the ecosystem. And we also go at great lengths to make sure that the problem that Andrew mentioned doesn't happen. And the problem actually is like, if you allow delegation, then what's going to happen is that perhaps someone is going to be so popular that eventually he's going to be the dictator of the system. So once you allow delegation, like, this is the critical threshold and the problem to solve, which is, if you want, also the problem of democracy in general, right? How can you avoid the popularity contest that eventually someone, we end up in a situation where the whole system becomes centralized to one entity. So we went to great lengths of this, doing like quite extensive game theory analysis. So I'll just tell you a little bit around how the system works. So people that have stake in Cardano, they can just do two different things. They can pledge their stake, and they can become then, in that case, a part of a node that is supposed to be online, has responsibilities, and their stake, in a sense, is tied to that node. It's like their skin in the game. On the other hand, there's something else that you can do. If you think about it, pledging and creating a node is like proposing to the community that here I am, I want to be a viable node in the ecosystem. So another option you have as a stakeholder is to say, I don't have anybody that I would like to partner with, or I'm not confident myself of running this complicated software that requires me to do all that. I have no experience of running a server or being a member of a team that can do that. But what I can do is review the community's proposals for those nodes and back those nodes that I believe they are valuable members of the community. So basically, if you think about it, is crowdsourcing the problem of selecting the nodes to the community at large. And we want to do that in a way which is very equitable. So we don't want to have participation barriers. So we want to say, if you really think that you can run a node and you can advertise to the community that fact, we would like you to start that. So there is no barriers to entry. But at the same time, we have a mechanism that via capping the rewards that every node can get, we want to control the size of this resulting stake pools in the system. And at the same time, once you do that, you have to deal with the problem that there may be operators that engage in this typical behavior of creating multiple identities in this identity infrastructure, trying to control more than their fair share. So to counter this, we have a mechanism that does take into account the amount of stake pledged in every node. So if you pledge more, you get more rewards. And this is something that prevents you from spreading your pledge very thin and trying to control a lot of identities. So all that comes together to a quite intricate mechanism which we have analyzed in the game theoretic model, and we've shown that this mechanism enjoys like various good properties, such as it has a natural equilibrium where the system becomes decentralized in a number of pools, which is a parameter of the system that we can set it to any value we want, and all of them have the same amount of stake. And something to focus the point here of this, I want to say something also about mathematical modeling and analysis. So this is an important part of our methodology. At Cardano and at IOSK, we don't use the system with mathematical models and proofs that they work, and the evidence about why we make every particular design decision. And that's important because, I want to think about that algorithm design is really hard. And we're talking about here cryptographic algorithms, mechanistic design algorithms for game theoretic outcomes. Think about very simple problems with computer science. They have very intricate algorithmic solution. Just think about even, internal application, over the last few decades have a lot of algorithmic improvements. So if you have a new algorithm, you cannot just, say, well, this algorithm makes sense. I coded it, and I just give you some examples that it works. You have to develop together with these algorithms models and arguments and proofs that these algorithms actually meet certain expectations, or they have like a baseline of operation that can be demonstrated. So I want to advocate. I have advocated many times in the past. I want to deep advocate in our community. If we want to be taken seriously, and I'm not talking about Cardano, I'm talking about our whole community altogether. If we want to be taken seriously as the new global financial infrastructure, we have to do the work. And our community, I think, has tremendous talent. It has tremendous talent. I'm doing this work for many years. I'm also a professor at the university. I know what I'm talking about. This community has tremendous talent. And I think we have to put it to good use to develop these systems together with the coding that we need to do and the mathematical models that we need to do. The tools are there, they exist. So it's up to us to use them. Back to you, Maxime, on that.
Yeah, cannot agree more. So, new field entering. And you want to add something to it?
No, sorry, but I guess I can just start talking on Polkadot now.
Yes.
Yeah. So just to answer like your three.
Microphone close.
Is it off?
You have to maybe unmute.
Oh no.
Closer.
Hello.
Yeah.
All right. I'm sorry. I must have just bumped the button. So just to answer some of the questions that Maxime had asked earlier on, like just sort of the basic outline. Sort of as Adrian said, Polkadot pretty straightforward from that perspective and similar to Tezos. We have a number of validators, about 200 right now on Polkadot, a little over 600 in Kusama, and nominators, as we call them, as others call delegators, because everyone has to come up with their own names for things, right? That can delegate their stake. So I think one of the interesting things about Polkadot and its how it's differentiated from some of these, aside from, again, we've got standard 28 days for unbonding period, and both nominators and validators can be slashed, is some of the ways that we've developed in order to prevent some of this centralization. So this is similar to what Aglos was talking about, although we have a different approach to it. So if you are part of the active validator set, if you're a validator, you will get approximately the same rewards. It doesn't matter how much stake is behind you. If you have $100 million or if you have $1 million, if you're able to get into the active validator set, you will get essentially the same rewards. However, there are some drawbacks like to running multiple of these validators. And for instance, going offline, if a single validator goes offline, they're not slashed at all. It's actually less than 10% of the validators go offline in a single epoch, a 6-hour period, then we assume that's just standard, this stuff happens, right? The network went down, it's not an attack on the network. However, if it's more than 10%, and as was mentioned earlier, we've seen this happen on the Polkadot network, then you get slashed, and this slashing amount increases as the amount of validators that were offline during the same epoch increases. Because this means, if 15, let's say 15% of the validators go offline at the same time, there's a likelihood that they're sharing something. So they're either all, whatever, in the same data center, or they're run by the same group or entity. So we really, punish them. So if 10% go offline, they get splashed 1%, but if 15% go offline, perhaps 5%. And so there's a sort of a pushback towards decentralization. It's almost the opposite of an economy of scale. There's an economy of being just big enough to be in the active validator set, but not any bigger, because any problems that you face with these larger ones are actually going to be multiplied.
Okay, so it's an interesting approach here. Yeah, please.
Okay, so is it on? Yeah. So it was mentioned before that in most proof of stake protocols, the efficiency kind of goes down if you have increasing number of nodes, and that's the reason to have delegation. So I want to kind of clarify this a bit and explain also Concordion's approach about that, because this is basically true for this kind of BFT style kind of consensus protocols that give you fast finality, right? There you don't want to have, say, more than 1,000 nodes or maybe 10,000 or whatever. If you push it too much, then it will get very inefficient. Right? But you can also have proof of stake protocols like Cardano, for example. It's like closer to a Bitcoin, where it actually doesn't matter. You can have unlimited number. Right? And the downside of that protocols then is that, as in Bitcoin, you have a much slower finality. You have to wait for several blocks before you can consider something final. And that's why we at Concordion basically combine both approaches. You have kind of a two-layer design where you have this kind of basic blockchain where you can have unlimited number of participants that produce blocks. So we call them bakers, the people who produce the blocks. But then on top of that, we kind of have what we call finalizers who run this BFT-style consensus protocol to then declare blocks as final, which gives you then fast finality. And from the finalizers, we then have a limit on the number of nodes. And so this way we try to have the best of both worlds. And because of that, also we kind of, at least initially, don't want to have delegation to avoid the issues that have been discussed before, and also to reduce the possible complexities. So slashing was another question. So we are currently discussing what exactly we want to do there. So this has not been ultimately decided. But what we don't want to do is kind of to slash people for things that are kind of like being offline, for example, right? Because so this can also happen by accident, and we don't want to kind of punish people for just their computer crashing. And also this is kind of an implicit punishment anyway, right? I mean, if you're online and produce a block, you get a reward for making the block. So if you're not online, you cannot make blocks, you already lose something, right? And we don't want to punish them in addition to that. So a situation where slashing can make sense, and what we're discussing is kind of what was called is like safety violations. So if you try to assign two different blocks that are conflicting, that's kind of a bad thing, and you don't do that by accident. So that is where we consider doing some slashing, but we don't have decisions on the details there yet.
No. All right. Maybe an important point for the audience to understand so why you need safety slashing is probably pretty obvious, because you can create diverging chains. If more than a third does equivocate some blocks, they can, by using network splits, try to create two competing chains effectively, diverging chains. The reason why you need liveness slashing or some form of punishment for people that do not produce blocks is that in traditional BFT systems, so this doesn't apply to the probabilistic backwater style consensus systems, but for all the fast finality systems, this applies that if you have more than a third that's offline, that stops working. Full stop. You don't have any finality anymore. And secondly, even worse, if more than a third loses their keys due to some sort of catastrophic event, you have to hard fork, and someone has to manually decide who to remove from that set. Because there's no way to automatically recover from, let's say, 34% losing their keys. Which is why you not only need liveness slashing, but you also need to relatively quickly remove people from the active validation set in case they're offline, because if the reason why they're offline is because they lost their keys, as soon as you hit the 2/3, 1/3 threshold, someone has to decide, using social consensus, how to restart the chain, which is like one of the major downsides of traditional BFT, which this Nakamoto-style consensus doesn't have. And you can combine them in fancy ways so that you can have Nakamoto-style consensus to recover the BFT, but all of this is touchy.
Yeah.
How many questions do you still have?
Well, we can limit to 2.
Yes, and then because I think the audience will have quite interesting questions.
Yeah, okay. So I will limit to 2 questions and that's it.
Yeah.
Over the years, have you been building, you personally or in the team which you are now part of, the challenges or in proof of stakes which have been resolved? It's one thing, but what do you see as the current challenges now, which you realize it is unknown field? Of course, there is still field we don't know is still unknown, but now we see it's a kind of, we don't know if it really works. We assume, we hope, but we see some challenge. Yeah, be it scales of a network or whatever you believe as a current challenge right now.
Can we start from this side first?
Okay, so with respect to what we recently have solved is kind of what I mentioned before, kind of this combination of the Nakamoto-style blockchain and this price penalty, kind of combine both of them together in a way to get good properties. That is what we have recently solved, and we also follow this approach that Agalos mentioned, that we want to prove everything mathematically. So just this year at the SEN conference, colleague, so also here actually presented the paper where we have mathematical proofs for this system that it works properly, and so that's what we did most recently. And so the biggest challenges I see at the moment are kind of scalability, which probably sharding is a way to solve that. I mean, maybe there are also other ways to do that, but I mean, how to do that really in a secure way, that you have real scalability also, that I see as the current biggest challenge.
Yeah.
So I think that the big challenge that we did, and Adrian actually sort of referenced this about like doing sort of interesting things. We have Polkadot has a hybrid consensus model where we have this probabilistic algorithm and then a more close to like classical BFT algorithm for finalization. So that's been really interesting and cool to see that evolve, and we see it working now on both Polkadot and Kusama, our Canary network. I see a challenge, and this is interesting because it's not quite technical, is that in order to really be involved in our proof of stake system does involve some knowledge and decisions that need to be made. And it's interesting, and I'll be curious to see, like, empirically, are people going to follow when we were writing the papers? We already see, people are not, they don't always act like rational models and rational agents. And I'll be really curious to see, now that in the real world people are doing this, again, with a relatively complicated system and making these decisions, how is that going to work in terms of, compared to our models that we put together?
I guess, what do you see as the current challenge on one side, and you can also say is the biggest achievements or what you've been solved, what have been solved recently, which was hard?
Right, yeah, so just to add to, the topics that other people already mentioned that I agree is, one issue that we haven't talked about, which is also very important challenge, is privacy. And in itself, proof of stake makes the situation even more difficult for privacy-enhanced systems. This is something actually that we've invested already a lot of work. So we've done, for example, a privacy-preserving version of the reverse protocol that we've released last year as a design document, as a system. But there's still a lot of work to be done on privacy, on the privacy aspect. And just to appreciate the point here, is like proof of stake by itself, requires proof that you possess a virtual resource, and that by itself you can think of it as against your privacy, right? So just the fact that you somehow contribute to the protocol and you're active in the protocol means that you have, your privacy could be affected. So actually reconciling this is a fascinating research question. And we've done some work that I'm really happy about, but there's still like a ton of interesting questions to be done and to be tackled in this direction. And then I would just add some other things about scalability. I mean, there's a ton of like very nice ideas that we're exploring right now, but there's still like it remains actually deploying this properly, standardizing the cryptographic primitives that are needed. In many cases, we have quite sophisticated and novel cryptographic primitives that are necessary, and actually like implementing them properly in sort of bulletproof implementations requires standardization, requires also the community to come together and kind of figure out the best possible ways or the most standardized versions of these algorithms so that we can use. And finally, like we have to be more, I should add, on the game theoretic aspect, because it's really, really important to understand the game theoretic and economic aspects more. There's a ton of research to be done still in the direction of mechanism design. Very, very interesting problems. Think also about governance of proof of stake systems, which they are very, by nature, they are quite amenable to facilitating some type of governance structure that people can use the system itself for decision making. But then you have like more issues even of privacy, and even if you want fundamental problems in social choice that are related to social choice theory, what would be the best way that we can facilitate the system to evolve? How do you organize a decentralized software update? So, for example, this is some of the work that we've recently done and published on blockchain protocol updates. But I would say there's still like, in many of these issues, there's still like a lot of good research that needs to be done. So, very excited and privileged, I should say, that we're working on in this area. There's a lot of nice questions to solve and think about. Back to you, Marcin.
Yeah, privacy, can't agree more. It will be challenging. Done right? Biggest challenges we're facing or when...
Yeah, so I think it was mainly already mentioned. I wouldn't like scaling, I would kind of take that separately because this is about proof of stake, and I would say like scaling and sharding is another additional topic, and that is huge, and I think there's a lot of research needed. In terms of proof of stake, I see like the biggest challenge right now is to actually like run it with serious economic stakes. I think like that hasn't been done yet, like with like actually like a huge chain like Bitcoin or Ethereum. And so I mean that's where we'll see like how it actually works, and when there might be attacks that actually like can potentially like have huge economic impact, and that will make a big difference. And the other thing is like I think like what Agilo said, like privacy, validator privacy is like a huge topic, and I think like we will have to do a lot on that in the next few years to make proof of stake actually secure, because otherwise we'll suffer from all kinds of software attacks and so on.
Yeah, thank you.
I think there are lots of unsolved problems, really. Interesting enough, I hold a very contrarian view here that I don't think scalability is actually an issue. Let's start off with all these chains launching, we have 100% more block space available than we actually have use cases for them. This sort of is over the industry as a whole, but even within Ethereum, like where you see most usage right now, it's very cyclical, and we haven't seen sort of long-term continuous use cases that really need 1000x transaction throughput, right? We've seen sort of the fundraising wave, and that died down. We've seen the DeFi wave, and that is dying down now. But I think one of the biggest challenges as an industry which we have is like, what real long-term continuous problems are we solving for people? And no one has a real answer for this. We have tons of empty block space, and we need to find use cases to fill those blocks. I think security is going to be another big challenge. We also have seen currently it's more profitable to be building these systems than to attack them. This is particularly true for most of the novel chains. And I think there comes a point in the future where this isn't necessarily going to be the case. And at that point, really we'll see under what conditions these systems fall over. They may be game theoretical attacks, they may be simple exploits in the implementations, we'll see. So security. I think another huge area is going to be governance, and this comes from very personal experience. We've deployed multiple Tezos upgrades at this point that sort of at the peak upgraded $4 billion of value. And believe me when I tell you, if you write the code that upgrades $4 billion of value in a linear fashion, the moment that block hits, that's a terrifying experience on whether this actually works, no matter the testing you did. So, and I think we've started to explore that we can have governance systems where people can decide on what future versions we go to, but we really don't have a good answer to the question, how do we upgrade a system where we don't have to switch $4 billion into the new protocol version tomorrow, where we can sort of incrementally try this out with real value, like test it on real value. What I think has been mostly solved actually is sort of consensus and proof of stake. I think we're getting there. We're still experimenting, but I'm not expecting massive fundamental advances there. And then I think the other thing that our industry has fully ignored is privacy. Like all this DeFi stuff is going to lead to a massive tax reckoning for people that have played with this, because all this data is fully public. And we really haven't spent any time, because there was money to be made in sushi, on like figuring out how to do any of this privately. Like financial systems aren't great if they aren't private. I think we currently like our traditional systems because they're very private, except to a few select actors, but they're not private, public to everyone. And maybe the last large challenge which we'll be facing relatively soon is actually interoperability. So how we start, because I fundamentally don't believe that we live in this world where one blockchain rules them all. Like, it'd be terrifying if Ethereum becomes the world financial system, because we don't want a world government, and for that reason we don't want to put all finances on Ethereum or Polkadot or Tezos. Doesn't really matter. Like, we're going to be, and this is also not how humans work. Like, we're going to be looking at an ecosystem of many chains coexisting, and I think one of the main challenges will be, how do you make sure that people aren't locked into these walled gardens of networks, but where they can freely move their assets between different systems that can honestly serve different niche use cases, right? Like, not everything is going to be a generalized computer. Something may be a very good private payment solution. Another thing may be a great NFT solution. And the challenge for interoperability will really be figuring out how we can move an ETH into Polkadot, into Tezos, how we move an XDZ into NIA, into Solana, and how this all works sort of the same way that the internet works currently, where we can, like, where data flows freely, independent of the services that we're using. Yeah, I think those are some of the biggest challenges. Oh, and just a random one, it's networking. No one really has figured this out, especially for all the sharding solutions. How you have like efficient networking between subsets of validators on each shard is a very big research problem that everyone is currently glossing over. And someone really should be figuring this out, because this is critical, especially as we scale up the validator sets.
Yeah, that was in a list of questions about sharding. But now I will cut to the last question. It's initially or mainly was Ethereum 2.0. When is it coming? How we're progressing? And what is the next step which we can expect? But yeah, so that will be a question to you then, Brad. And as far as what will be the next major milestones on your network?
Yeah, so we are planning to launch Phase 0 in this year, which will be the first part of the ETH 2.0 protocol and launching. Everything right now seems like there are no blockers, so like we just had a very successful testnet launch. We had some testnet launches before that where more validators were offered in the beginning, partly because they forgot or partly because there were some kind issues, but the last one was LinkedIn, went very well, and so we're quite positive that we can do it this year. This will, as you may know, only basically be purely a proof of stake network with no other function than basically just running proof of stake. So in a way, you could still call it like a sort of incentivized testnet if you want. But this will basically give us the assurance that the proof of stake part of the protocol is working well, and within the next year or so, we will then add the data shards, which will basically allow us to put lots of data that is proved to be available on these two, which will be its first function. And potentially, so Vitalik recently posted this sort of alternative roadmap for ETH2 that is slightly different to what was originally envisioned. So like in the past, we have emphasized that we want all the shards to be able to be fully compute, full compute shards, so that they are able to execute as well as include data. There is now another alternative proposal where we basically say, well, I mean, rollups are already massively popular. It might make sense that this is just the way to go in the future, and this will stay this way. So then, essentially, the roadmap might be shortened to just have all those shards into data, and once we then transition each one onto ETH2, which is sort of, I would say, rough timeline of that is probably like realistically 1.5 to 2 years or so. That then that is basically the end state already, and that would mean that we have this ETH1 EVM that can access all the data on all the shards, and thus already provide massive scaling benefits.
Okay. So we're very excited for this coming year. And do you want to maybe just shortly for some exciting coming?
Banking accounts and private transfers of smart contracts coming to Tezos in the next 3 months or so, which will allow anyone to have private transfers to arbitrary assets. And banking accounts will allow things like key rotation and multi-sig for governance for validators to vote.
Okay. And Gelos, what can we expect from Cardano in the next coming months as the biggest milestones?
Yeah, so the biggest milestones coming up is, so I should say the system now is, it's running, there's more than 1,000 pools, it's more than 50% of the total stake in Cardano is actually participating in staking. What you expect to see next short few months is expanding further the language of basically what type of programs that you can run on top of the system. So we have multi-currency support coming up, which basically will give you the ability to define custom tokens on top of Cardano. Now the next thing that comes up is full scale smart contracts using our functional programming language, Bluetooth. So basically, this is like the two major things that are coming up. And then at the same time, there's like all kinds of threads, research that are going to be rolling in together, which include our scalability solutions, which include both layer 2 protocols, different flavors, in this case, sidechains. So we have all kinds of scalability updates coming up. And then, of course, we have the governance system, which is already now in the testing phase, and basically that will give the capability on Cardano to have, make use of its treasury, which is a certain portion of the funds that are part of the ecosystem, that then the community, the stakeholder community of Cardano will be able to manage that via a voting mechanism, and then the system will be able, the community itself will be able to dictate what type of improvements and enhancements the Cardano system will take next. So that is going to be happening in the next, the first thing I said is happening in the next few months, and then the rest happening in the next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good, thank you.
Yeah.
Bill.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking. Yes?
Yes.
fantastic.
Yeah, I was just double checking that it wasn't muted. So the two big milestones that I would think of coming in the next few months are both occurring on Kusama, which is our canary network. So there's the Polkadot network, but we have another network which is not the test net, but we roll out changes earlier called Kusama. And we're currently in the process of moving from 600 to 1,000 validators on Kusama. So it's this larger number of validators and seeing what happens. But I would say the more interesting and exciting thing is parachains coming to Kusama. So parachains are, again, we have to come up with our own words for everything, our version of shards. So if you think of our relay chain as similar to ETH2's beacon chain, that has been running for a while, for Kusama almost a year now. The shards, the parachains, we have them working on test nets, and we plan on rolling those out to Kusama sometime in the next few months. Those are the big ones.
Okay.
Yeah, so we are currently running a test net, and so the next big milestone will be to launch the mainnet, which is planned for next year. And yeah, then we'll see how it runs with real stakes.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So now we will pass to the questions from the audience. I just ask you to speak super loud because we don't want to go with microphones around. Speak loud and we will repeat. We can repeat so everybody, and I will write for everybody online to listen. So who wants to start with questions? Yes, please. Say your name, organization, and yours.
So I'm Alison Fromm. I'm a passionate follower of all things crypto. I've heard the projects mention the term bonding. Could you say for the average investor or delegator, how does bonding work in your project and what benefits does it bring?
So I will shortly repeat the question. It's been mentioned bonding. Yeah. So for participant as a validator, what does it mean in your project, and what benefits does it bring, and maybe also what risks?
Yeah.
Right. So in Tezos, if you don't want money on node, you can also delegate or bond equivalent terms to some other validator or baker, as you call them in Tezos. Tezos also came up with its own terms, so I really shouldn't be saying anything about this. But it practically means that you don't lose custody of your funds, but you assign the resulting consensus-relevant voting rights and sometimes also the governance-relevant voting rights to the validator. And in return, you receive not a reward or not a yield or interest. You receive part of the inflation. This is not real. If markets are efficient, this is not a yield or interest rate. So you receive part of the network inflation that is there to fund the security of the system. Your validator will take some cut, some commission, and it is your job as a delegator to select a good actor within the system. So if you just delegate to random idiots, that does not have great consequences for the network. And this, by the way, this applies to Tezos, but this also applies to every other network generally that has funding.
So bonding in Polkadot has a slightly different meaning because apparently we cannot agree on terms. So when you bond, you are actually locking your funds for a specific period of time, and then in Polkadot mainnet, and for 28 days you cannot unbond them, you cannot transfer them. But there's a second step of actually nominating. So you could bond funds and lock them and never decide to actually nominate any particular validators. But in order to nominate, in order to share in the rewards, then you need to bond first. It's like the first step towards staking is locking these funds up for a given period of time so that they are liable to slashing.
I don't know, Dan, do you have in design a definition of bonding?
No, we do not have anything separate. You can only stake. If that's what the request refers to, that is the security deposit you make as a staker, and that can potentially be slashed if you equivocate.
Yes, this was what I was thinking too. Against, how is the
Yeah, I guess the way that I can interpret that question in the context of Cardano would be that there is this concept what we call pledge, which I think is the equivalent one here. So when you create a stake pool, it has to come with a certain pledge that you do in a stake, basically, that is supposed to be associated with the pool and to stay with it, because this is the skin in the game that the stake pool operator or group of stake pool operators have. I should say, though, that we don't have slashing of that stake, and perhaps like maybe a bigger point here that I want to make about this is that if you think about punishment in general and fines, these should make sense only if you set them in the context of an economic model that shows that they incentivize the right behavior. I mean, so a fine or a penalty by itself does not just work just because you have it. I mean, if it was the case that just the fine solves problems, then we wouldn't have crime, right? So for all crimes, we have penalties and we have like bad things that can happen to those that perpetrate them, but this doesn't limit them, right? So what happens with these bonds is that they affect your rewards. So you are like incentivized to make those pledges. So these are essential, but this is like positive incentivization rather than a negative one. This being said, we're not sort of against this idea, and this is something that we always continuously review within our game theoretic and economic modeling. And this is something that, if it makes sense with the current economic model of the system, it's something that could be done. So there is this corresponding aspect of someone's stake that if it backs a stake pool is something that binds them to that. On the other hand, for those that delegate, there is no constraints. And basically they can change their delegation according to the way they view the system, according to the best possible way that they can think for the longevity of the system. So they can change their delegation to another pool, for instance, if they believe that that particular pool is not serving them well. And this is something that is completely up to their choice. Back to you, Master.
Yeah, thank you. Matt?
So I mean, I don't think we use the term bonding, but I mean, we have the same mechanism for lockups that have been mentioned before. So if you want to stake something to produce blocks, you have to first kind of lock up your stake for a certain amount of time. And that's not only important for slashing, but also for security in general, because if you don't do that, like you could do things like quickly moving around your stake to different nodes and then do like weird attacks, and that's why you have to kind of lock it up. So you could call that bonding, but I don't think we do that.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Any other question? Do you have guys for the panel? Yes, please, Alan.
Is there a mechanism to recover from a 51% attack?
Is there a mechanism to recover from 51% attack?
Yes, it's you restart the chain effectively. But this applies to every chain, by the way. Like you come to social consensus and you start from a clean slate. No, you don't necessarily have to get rid of all existing state, but you have to certainly kick out the 51% that's malicious. Yeah, this applies to every chain. Unless this doesn't apply to any of yours, in which case I'd be very interested to hear.
We all agree on yes, we recover, but we restart from the moment before attack and we remove.
I mean, I didn't exactly understand the answer, but I mean, the assumption you always have to recover out of bank from 51% attack pretty much, although Vitalik recently shared some very interesting thoughts that you might want to have a read on how to at least somewhat automate the detection and the potential recovery mechanisms. So that basically you detect 51% attacks by being online, right? So in a synchronous setting, it's always easy to detect any attack, and that is really the key. But then we will have to go back to the social layer typically and say like, well, I mean, here something clearly happened, and yeah, we got to go back to the checkpoint.
Yeah, please again.
Should I? Yeah. Okay, so I think it's a great question. So it also will allow me to just point to some of the very recent work that we published. So we did a very thorough analysis of what happens in various blocks and systems when they're under, what we call adversarial supremacy. So I would invite people in the audience that are interested to search for this most recent paper that we just published. Maybe a few weeks ago, or maybe a bit more. So it's called Consensus Redux, Distributed Ledgers in the Face of Adversarial Supremacy. So what's interesting there is that, okay, 51% is bad, right? So you can, actually come up with a mathematical proof that says when you are in such a situation, things are difficult, like you're going to lose the basic properties of the ledger, consistency and liveness. And just I want also to emphasize the point that it's not even possible necessarily to detect that, right? So a loss of liveness is not something that is publicly detectable in the network. So you can do indefinitely censored just because someone has 51% capability. Nevertheless, what's interesting is that what we proved in that paper is that Bitcoin by itself has a mechanism of absorbing a 51% attack. So there is damage, but the protocol itself can return back to normality. So this is a very interesting property. So basically, the fact is that a 51% attack can be compartmentalized in the time domain. So if you have a jitter, let's say, or suddenly, let's say, the system, suddenly you have an attacker which is over 51%. What does that mean about the ledger that is actually going over years, right? Does it mean that you lose everything? Or can you compartmentalize the problem and then recover from it? So what mechanisms does the protocol actually offer for that? And what we prove actually that it is possible to get a similar property in a proof of stake setting, especially if you have bounds in the length of time over which the adversarial supremacy manifests itself. So it is possible to recover from 51% attack if they're suitably bounded in time. And I think that's something good to keep in mind when you're thinking about the actual deployment of these systems, because attacks like that cannot be excluded. And those that are interested to see more details about that, I would welcome you to search and get the paper that I mentioned. So I think there's a lot of more interesting things to discover in this space. And it also shows an example here that we cannot exclude anything from the threat model. We have to think about these mechanisms. We have to think about exactly what we can do. And if there are impossibility results, we have to always keep thinking, what can we do to circumvent them? We'll always revisit our basic assumptions about what we do in the systems, and always think whether there are mechanisms that will make it feasible to circumvent problems like that. Because in real-world systems, such problems cannot be excluded, and we have to be ready and be able to figure out ways that these things can be mitigated.
Sorry, but a quick question. How can, in proof of stake, how can 51% attack be handled limited? Once you have 51%, that you have it forever if you want.
Yeah, so it really depends on what you think about being a 51% attack here. So obviously you have a 51% attack on the global state. What you say is right. But now imagine a situation where you have a 51% attack, not because the attacker has 51% globally, but he has 51% out of the active population that is running at a particular point in time. Right? So this is still a 51% attack because the active population is dominated by the adversary.
Right.
And so this still manifests itself as a 51% attack.
So I get from that your chain does not use attestations to because in E2 that period is 6 minutes, like every 6.4 minutes, everyone will participate in the chain.
Yeah, so if you have an online requirement that is global, as it is in the Ethereum setting, so a 51% attack at the global scale cannot be absorbed, but the 51% at the local scale, it's still a problem, and it's possible to be absorbed. This is the idea.
Okay.
Interesting.
I think that a good chain should not have any of such local attacks.
This is actually a topic for another meeting. We have to do that.
Sure.
Bill, do you want to end?
Yeah, I mean, is this on? Why? I just love pressing the mute button, I guess. Not much to add. I mean, a 51% attack, if you would require, if you really wanted to reset that, there's a 51% attack on an adversary at 51% of stake on Polkadot relay chain would require manual intervention really to continue. So I haven't read that adversarial superiority paper though, so I'd be curious to read it.
Maybe just one small thing to come back to the first question we had. I think that's also the difference between proof of work and proof of stake. Because here, really what's special about proof of stake, if you have, as Agava said, this global attack, and the attacker has 51% of the stake and never sells it, but there's no way to recover from that really. In proof of work, that's a difference, right? If someone has 51% of all the computers, someone else can just buy more computers. So
I would argue that this is way easier to recover on proof of stake. Like if a random dude on the internet buys up 51% of the stake, I mean, first of all, that's expensive as hell. And secondly, sort of the moment the majority of the community realize they can call it a social hard fork and completely wipe out that 51% of stake, thereby completely nullifying the attack. In proof of work, this is way harder. Like once miners have 51%, it's really difficult for the community to sort of go and blow up the miners because they will still have them. Like this is, I think, the real advantage in proof of stake.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't consider hard fork as a solution, but I mean, of course, yes. I mean, it's true.
Okay, one last question from the audience, and we will finish the session because we have a little bit long. Does anybody want to ask something to finalize the event? Curiosities? Yes, please. Yes, go ahead.
Well, in relation to slashing, kind of slash and burn, or slash and hoard, or slash and distribute, kind of share, what do you do with
Yeah, that's I think it's a nice question. So the question was about slashing. Slash is burned, distribute, or on hold. Yeah? Or
like route into the treasury?
Yes, or take into the treasury. So what is the approach in your protocol?
Tezos burns half and distributes the other half to the person that found the equivocation.
So you incentivize constant search for...
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a point that like people should be looking out for equivocations
in terms of
legacy. Yeah, and interesting enough, in the beginning, a bunch of people ran misconfigured nodes, and some people made a fair bit of money by just reporting them all the time.
Okay.
Yeah. So first I'd say that slash and distribute is pretty much the same as slash and burn. If you're giving 100 whatever tokens equally to everyone, or just burning 100, you've reduced the supply. I think it would be equal. But what Polkadot does is actually distribute to the treasury in general, unless it was found by a particular role called a fisherman, who their goal is to look for these equivocations. And then they would get a portion of that as a reward, pretty much for the same rationale.
Bankrupt?
So in these two, it's pretty much also, but there's a very small part that goes to the whistleblower, but we burn it all. And I think like the only difference that is made with distribution, you could choose to give it to the other validators rather than the whole network. So basically, you could like either make it accrue to only the stakers or to everyone, and in our case, it's burnt to everyone.
How do you do it in Cardano?
Yeah, so basically this type of unclaimed rewards or rewards that are not, because as I said, there's no slashes in Cardano, but what happens is that there are rewards that remain unclaimed, exactly because people are below performance or they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So these actually are going back to the unclaimed rewards and the treasury in some percentage.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, so we currently don't have slashing implemented.
Yeah. Then nothing to be reclaimed. Good. Thanks everyone for sharing so much about your research done, work done, and your views for the future. I personally wrote quite a few things. It's difficult to keep up with everything, but now, to some degree, knowledge increased. And thanks to Civil for organizing and inviting so many nice people.